Hello, everyone. Welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. Thanks for joining us. And if you've gotten this far and you've joined us in the past, please make sure to like, subscribe, and make sure you let us know what you thought of the show. I'm here, of course, as always, with Charlie Araujo of the DX Institute. And how are you today, Charlie?
I'm doing great. A little exhausted, running on fumes. The toddler and my work has just been killing me. But New York is one of those places that, there's always this give and take, and sometimes it takes and sometimes it gives. And we got a little bit of both. My Mets lost. That was definitely the
Yep.
take. But it's been like a second summer here. It's 80 degrees today, blue skies, sunshine. It's absolutely. I put shorts back on. I just was supposed to put them away last weekend. Thank God I didn't get to it, and so I was able to. Pull my shorts back out for one last hurrah. So it's been a beautiful weekend here in New York. So all in all, it all comes out in the wash, I guess.
Yeah, it's funny. We didn't quite cross paths while I was in New York last week, but it was 40 degrees when I was there. So what the hell?
Exactly. We thought winter was coming in full force, and then boom. So that's how it goes sometimes.
Yeah. But on that note, of course, we've been talking about AI all the time in IT. It is obviously a dominant driver for investment right now. And one of the stories that you shared with me prior to this today's call was around Microsoft and OpenAI apparently starting to have some issues working together, which isn't quite a surprise as we've talked about in the past. But what got your attention this time around? Or
Well, so this is a New York Times article. It's a fairly in-depth one. It's a good sort of, New York Times doesn't get into tech all that often, but when they do, they go deep. And so it was a useful thing. But as you said, we've been talking about this for a while. So nothing earth-shattering in terms of, for those of us that follow it, this has been bubbling for quite some time, and OpenAI becoming a true for public or for-profit rather company recently sort of solidified that Microsoft and OpenAI are very clearly competitive partners. So the article is interesting for the sort of inside baseball aspect of it, but the thing that really brought my attention, like I almost skipped it until I got to the end of the article, and it talks about how in the midst of this sort of fraying of the relationship and the tension of the contractual obligations, that there's this odd clause. And the clause in the contract says that if OpenAI develops AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is this debatable term, but effectively is supposed to mean an artificial intelligence that is surpassing human capability and has that degree of autonomy, that if they were to do that, then the contract is voided, that they can get out of the contract, and the original, remember, they started as a nonprofit and they were
Mhm.
supposed to be this ambivalent sort of organization. The original intent was that if they developed this groundbreaking technology that had such a great impact on the world, that they didn't want a big for-profit entity like Microsoft to have it. But of course, now they're the for-profit entity, and so it's kind of ironic, particularly because in the contract it's the OpenAI board alone that apparently gets to decide what's AGI. So it was just sort of like, huh, that's kind of this really, baffling almost or comical thing that's in the contract. And I guess the question is, does that, if you're a CIO, should that give you pause? Should that, factor into decisions?
Yes, I found it bizarre how OpenAI came out with ChatGPT, obviously groundbreaking technology by any standard, coming up on its second year out on the market, and then how quickly things have changed afterwards. It is really uncommon for a startup, even in the startup world, for things to change this quickly. For instance, most of their management team is now gone. Ilya Sutskever, after trying to fire the CEO, ended up leaving and doing his own startup. Their Mira Murati also, she ended up leaving. Will probably end up doing her own startup. Basically, all of the technical leads are basically leaving left and right, probably because they were true believers in the nonprofit aspect of OpenAI, which has really disappeared with the influx of investment that has come in. So, in light of that, Microsoft has to be thinking, we know this is a ticking time bomb. Obviously, the from the CEO on down, Microsoft is a very smart company. They are savvy, they understand tech. This new generation under Satya Nadella obviously is living in the current generation of technology in every respect. I have nothing but respect for Microsoft's executive team. So they're not stupid people. They know exactly what's going on much more deeply than we do. At the same time, this idea of artificial general intelligence has always been very iffy for me because computers being better than humans at things, yeah, that's been a thing for some time. If I'm going to try to find a large prime number, I'm not going to do it in my head. I'm not going to do it by hand. I'm going to use a computer, right? They're much better at math and computational skills than we will ever be. So, in that respect, sure, artificial intelligence has far surpassed humanity in many areas already, yet they're not good at thinking yet. So it'll be interesting to
Yeah,
see
what I
how it
think,
goes.
well, I do think it's interesting because on the one hand, like I still use ChatGPT, ChatGPT, the OpenAI models, much more than I use any of the others.
Mhm.
And that's a function of two things. One is it's baked into more things, right? So one of the tools I use, I don't have another option. They're using the OpenAI API.
Mhm.
And in another one where I do have access to all of them, I use for like basic search, I use the Perplexity engine, which of course is based on actually what I think it's based on Metas, but anyway, and and I sometimes use Claude, Anthropic's Claude, but I find actually that OpenAI still has the edge in terms of giving me the best results, the things that
Mhm.
I don't have to finesse the prompt and stuff as much. But one of the things the article points out, which I think is really a well taken point, is that the underlying cost and the infrastructure necessary to do this is literally something that these organizations, if you are not a Microsoft and Amazon and Google, that you can actually do, right? All of these, including OpenAI, are leveraging the hyperscalers to
Mhm.
deliver on those platforms. And until that changes, time is on the side of the Microsofts, the Amazons, the Googles of the world in this race. And so we'll see how long OpenAI is able to hold out and how long they're able to hold their advantage. It's going to be an interesting period.
Yes, but obviously OpenAI has every financial interest in declaring AGI as soon as possible. And Microsoft, using OpenAI as a research lab, basically has every interest in trying to keep OpenAI as basically a research subsidiary or a research lab for all of the Copilot stuff and everything else that Microsoft wants to do in AI. So, butting of heads at the highest levels of tech.
But what I think is interesting and important to recognize is that despite all of that, and sometimes I feel like it is the clash of the titans, right? We're watching the gods fight up on Mount Olympus while us mere mortals are trying to figure out, which way the boulders are going to roll down the hill.
Mhm.
Because there's a new study from IBM that you shared that talks about the fact, and what I found fascinating about this was the juxtaposition. So it talked about how, now I'm losing it, but it was 77% of industry. This was insurance industry leaders were saying that generative AI is going to be necessary just to keep pace, which is shocking to me. It's not even a competitive advantage, right? It's about you need to keep pace. I think that's probably wrong. I think that there's plenty of competitive advantage there, but nevertheless, that's what they think. And yet, insurance customers, their customers, only 29% are saying that they're ready to actually leverage these services, right? And so this massive divide, and I think we're seeing this. I was just talking to a former CIO friend of mine, and she was saying how she is struggling to find any CIOs that are in earnest really going down this road where they're like all in on AI. And so I think we continue to see this massive disconnect between all of this hype and massive investments and revenue, right? I mean, OpenAI has what, $3.5 billion or something in revenue now. I mean, we're
Mhm.
definitely, there's definitely money being spent, but actually reconciling that with where is everything lining up from a business standpoint and what's actually generating value. And we've been talking about that recently too, about the need to show returns. And I think that this is why, right? Stats like this out of this report are showing us why this is a problem.
Yeah, because it is a real issue that we all know the puck is headed in that direction. AI will eventually be a big driver for service and communications capabilities. We're not exactly quite sure how yet, though. And there is a big gap in trust at this point from a user perspective because we are in this, what does Gartner call it, that trough of disillusionment associated
Yeah,
with the hype
right.
cycle. Everybody's starting to find out for the first time as they compare generative AI to their areas of expertise that it does fall short as an expert in everything other than the most technical or specialized capabilities where there isn't as much garbage on the internet. But unfortunately, in most of the areas where we live in, there has been plenty of garbage and plenty of misinformation put out on the internet and other sources that has made its way into generative AI and made it difficult for generative AI to be fully accurate without some additional retrieval augmented generation, fine tuning, some other type of augmentation, which we've talked about ad nauseum in the past. But that grounding in actual data is an important piece of the puzzle. And it, despite the fact we've talked about it a lot, it doesn't change the fact that that is hard work to actually do in reality.
Well, it's incredibly hard work, and it's going to be the absolute necessary component to make this create value. It's also about the application of intent, and what I mean by that is going into this. Again, we've talked about this before as well, right? But going into this, knowing what you're trying to achieve, and starting with the business problem and then saying, can this technology help me solve it? And that's where I think the disconnect, right? In fairness, part of the problem is the study questions, right? They're asking it from a technology perspective versus from the business problem perspective to begin with, because they're trying to find out, right? I get it, but that's part of the root of it. And so there's another announcement which I think is interesting and I think is really important. I'm starting to believe. I mean, I don't think it's a surprise here. I'm an Amazon fan. I think that they've been um, sort of taking the right approach to a lot of things, cloud first AI, more recently, um, for a while. And
Mhm.
while they are often viewed as an AI laggard, they just announced a 5-year deal with Databricks specifically about, I think, trying to create this sort of competitive profile where it is AI's Trainium chips. Hate that name. They're Trainium AI. Their claim to fame on these is they are purpose built for AI. They're not general purpose GPUs. Um, and because of that, they claim that they therefore can hit the same level of performance at a much lower cost. So they claim to be 40% cheaper. Combined with Databricks, which of course made a lot of noise earlier in the year with their approach that they claimed that for I think it was $10 million, you can train a completely custom LLM. And so you start putting these two together, and the basic pitch here is that you can solve that problem you're talking about at a fraction of the price. And now suddenly, for an enterprise, start figuring out how you can actually apply this in a meaningful, custom way. And I think it's interesting. I think it's probably the right directional approach,
Yes, and this article written by Bell Lin, another one of our
of course.
favorites at Wall Street Journal, the CIO Journal, it also pointed out how Databricks purchased Mosaic ML last year to support these custom models, and that has been an important piece of the puzzle because Databricks wants companies to build their own custom models that are smaller in nature and may not require an entire fleet of GPUs to support. That's actually the right way to do it. You do not want to be dependent on having to spend millions and millions of dollars of compute just to put your model into production. So this combination of having the right way to create models quickly, as well as dedicated compute that is not fully dependent on NVIDIA, is probably a good move to be able to package things together. And I would expect that this becomes a more common package to be able to see. Of course, NVIDIA has already dug into microservices and a development environment and is ahead of the pack in that regard. But everybody is going to want their own packaging of models and hardware that is actually more controllable and perhaps more affordable than the kind of supply chain issues that have been making NVIDIA difficult to work with. Not due to NVIDIA's capabilities, but simply due to their production capabilities.
Yeah, and look at I think obviously Nvidia has been the golden child, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. But when you're in that position, you are pretty reticent to come to back off that, right? And so it leaves them vulnerable for this sort of a play of being able to come in with a pretty substantial cost savings. Um, and and I think and again, it's not like this is some little company nobody's heard of. This is Amazon, right? So I think it is very, very interesting to see the way this is starting to line up. And I'm starting to see Amazon plays it a little bit like Apple has historically played it, not first, but better. And
Mhm.
I see that that's kind of the angle they're taking. And I love the fact they're zeroing in, especially with this partnership, on these specific challenges. And again, if I'm a CIO, frankly much more applicable because I this is something I can actually potentially do something with in a real meaningful way versus just working off the big LLMs and sort of hitching my wagon to well, I hope they get it right and I hope that I don't get lost in the shuffle. So I think it was very, very interesting. But it's every week we're getting something different. So it's really tough to tell.
Yeah, and I think Amazon also has figured out to a better extent how to be the infrastructure player that it where they shine. When they go into software and even some platform capabilities, so they sometimes struggle to figure out what they're doing. But from an infrastructure side, they know that if they can find a use case that scales along with the IT market, they're going to shine in that regard. And as they start thinking about scaling further, we run into another issue that they're looking at, which is energy. Suddenly, Amazon is looking at supporting nuclear capabilities as well, partnering with a variety of utilities, and they're not the only one doing it. Honestly, Microsoft's doing it, Google's doing it. All the big companies are getting into nuclear, so it's trendy.
Yeah, and I've been a fan of the resurgence of nuclear. I think we're obviously entering an era where we're going to energy demands are not going to drop anytime soon, even with some of this improvement. The use cases around AI are just increasing. So this is a problem we need to solve, and I think it's a very legitimate way of solving it. I guess my question for you back is if I'm a CIO, while this may be esoterically interesting and part of my ultimate supply chain because I'm leveraging these major providers. Like you said, it's Amazon, Microsoft, I think just announced one. Um, so it's obviously relevant in that my suppliers are going down this road. But as a CIO, what like should I be taking something from this from your perspective?
Oh yeah, everybody should build a nuclear plant immediately. No, but seriously, I don't think it's a coincidence that Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Oracle, they're all betting on the fact that AI is probably going to 2x or 3x the amount of power that is needed by IT to get things done. They are investing in this capex right now, and these partnerships probably to bundle independent power with their own future data center builds. And for companies that are highly invested in their own private cloud or data center operations, this is probably something to consider as well. You may want to make sure that you have significant energy coverage that is off grid or probably hybrid with your utility to make sure that your data centers stay up and running. This might not be nuclear either. This might be whatever is most common for your area of the world. It could be wind, it could be solar, but some sort of independent energy supply capability is probably going to be a more common IT issue for the Fortune 500 over the next 5 to 10 years. You're not going to need it immediately, just as these companies don't need it immediately. Most of these companies are planning for 2030 right now. So if you're not planning to be a CIO in 15 years, maybe this is not really an issue for you. But if you are in it for the long haul, this is probably something you're going to run into before the end of your career.
Well, what I do find curious or interesting to see is will this, what I was going to say is, will this become something that is again a top of mind issue? So I remember back in the old days, 10 whole years ago, We would talk about how the fact we don't have a chief power officer at companies
Mhm.
anymore, right? Because that used to be a big deal, right? The dawn of the
Yeah.
industrial age, getting power into your plants and whatever was a big, big deal. And so you had dedicated resources who were responsible for that. And now, with utilities and the stability, at least here in the US, that it just was a sort of much a non-issue. Um, but now, at least when it comes to the tech stack, will it become an issue? Will it become differentiating? Will it be a decision that we actually are making choosing partners or vendors based on their power supply and their power grid, and can they sustain it? I don't know. I have a feeling it's going to be normalized. I'm not sure that it's going to be an entirely relevant thing, but I do think if you're a CIO, at least it's at least something you should be aware of and keeping your eye on, and that something that we haven't had to worry about much recently is now something we have to be thinking about again.
Yes, and I think the relevant numbers are that the estimates are that tech will continue to be, call it 3 to 4% of revenues from a spend perspective, but the energy usage is expected to go up from about 2% of current use, 2% of a company's current use to about 8%. So that so as that energy growth grows much faster than IT spend as a whole, we're going to have to try to figure out how to reconcile all of that. And probably more of IT's budget is going to go back into energy again. And then we're going to have to care about energy. I guess we're going to call it energy FinOps or whatever the trendy term ends up being, nuclear FinOps.
Nuclear, that will be your category. I will not get into that one. Staying on the topic of issues that CIOs need to be thinking about and concerned about, you shared another one. This one is actually unusual for us, not an article, but just a LinkedIn post from the chief HR officer of WiPro about their strategy of hybrid work. And I'm curious what your take, why did you share this and what your take on it is?
Yes, so Sarv Galvil of WiPro recently posted that WiPro was taking the stance toward hybrid work, that they were planning to have basically their associates work 3 days a week within the office, but then be able to have some sort of flexible capability to work at home and to be able to choose extended times at home if there was any sort of issue with family needs or other personal issues. And I found that to be a decent compromise, especially at a time when people are talking about going into founder mode and bringing people into the office 5 days a week, and all these executives complaining that they don't have the ability to talk to all of their direct reports in person at any time they want, which to me just sounds very entitled, frankly. In 2024, your management capabilities should be a little bit more flexible than that, I think. And so I think Wipro took the right note, especially as a lot of us know Wipro as this IT managed services company that company that at the end of the day is supposed to get the work done. And if they can figure out how to be this flexible, I don't see where many other companies have the wherewithal or the really moral high ground to say, well, we have to get work done
So,
in a
so
way faster than Wipro does.
So you're comparing and contrasting this to some of the recent announcements out of Dell and Amazon. We just talked about Amazon in a positive light, but I agree with you on this one. That they came back and put a stake in both these companies put a stake in the ground that you need to be in the office 5 days a week. And so you're taking this as like, well, why? That this is a better approach? That's kind of your feel.
I think so, or at least it shows what the practical approach is for companies that are trying to keep their employees. I do think some of this 5 day a week stuff is to try to create policies that can allow for laying off employees a little more easily because every large tech company overhired. Uh, but I think might be showing the difference between companies that didn't overhire and those that did, or companies that are trying to retain employees versus those that are happy to stay flat in the short term.
It is striking, in fact, that we didn't cover this because it wasn't really about IT, but Starbucks also was one of the companies that had gone to a full back in office
Hmm.
mode. And then, of course, they hired their new CEO, who is commuting from Newport Beach,
Yes.
California, and is not commuting every day. So, it is always interesting to see how the rules bend or change based on circumstances. I think this is going to be a determining thing over the long haul. I do agree in the short term that this is probably some opportunistic, hey, let's put this policy in place to cause people to resign and leave and what have you. I know in talking to CIOs, those that have remained, their companies have remained in a sort of a hybrid model. They found it to be very effective at being able to hire. That there are that they find by going and having a hybrid or a fully remote model, that it opens up their ability to bring on staff that they might not otherwise be able to hire, and that improves their ability to compete. If I'm a CIO today, I'm fighting super hard for this because I think it's I mean, I've sort of two minds of it, right? I get the collaboration side. I get there are times, even with what I'm doing now, that I would love to be in one place with everybody, for a
Hmm.
specific period of time to be able to work on something. But I did work in an office a long time ago, and I remembered what it was like. I mean, this idea that you just management by walking around stuff was, well, mostly BS because people were never at their desk anyway. They were wandering around
Yes.
wherever else in meetings,
Mhm.
or you spend half your time trying to find them. I would argue it's easier to find people with today's environment between Teams messaging or Slack and all the different forms of communication that we have, that we can actually get to people faster and easier. So, I think it's a red herring. And I do think this sort of balanced approach, what I think is smart here for WiPro, again, given sort of how you might think of them,
Mhm.
is that this was a very well-grounded sort of statement that communicated the importance of their staff. Um, and I think that's gonna serve them well.
Yeah. But I think at the end of the day as well, that this is going to be there's also an issue here around I think uh, what level of skills and the demand for those skills at this point. And we might be seeing that there is not as much of a demand for the high salary skills that have traditionally been compensated.
Well, I
I
mean,
wonder
it's
if we're
clearly
seeing a flip in IT value right now.
Well, I mean, we've seen the data. We've seen the data that, for the last 2 decades, the sure path to a high salary was to be in tech, to be in IT, and that has clearly fallen off. Where there's a number of folks that if you look at the data, where they're having a trouble maintaining, probably for the first time in their careers, where they may be taking a step backwards
Hmm.
in salary and in position. And that just, we sort of hit the saturation point. Now, I'm not sure, but and this is where I think some of these companies may be misguided. I'm not sure it's permanent, right? If leaving that particular data point aside, if you look at everything else we've been talking about, what are we talking about? We're talking about massive growth in scale and in needs across every spectrum of the tech
Hmm.
stack, right? Infrastructure, hardware, the software, the integration, everything, and we need people that understand this. And so I think what we are seeing more than anything is that we saw during the pandemic a lot of overhiring. We then saw an economic downturn that put a lot of pressure, with the interest rates rising, that you're seeing this rising. I don't think this is permanent. I think over the long haul, we're going to see these companies go back into hiring mode. I think, you always need to be concerned about your skills, but I think this is temporary. I will stand by my early predictions that the one thing the pandemic proved is that it can in fact work, and that all of these statements about collaboration and productivity, um, notwithstanding, that organizations understand and know that they can work in a fully remote, fully hybrid type model, and now it's just a choice. And so I think when things shift back, and I think they will, that we're going to see these policies sort of fade away again.
Yep. So I mentioned the supply demand piece, but there's also this issue around technology and whether technologists understand the value of what they're doing. So another story that got my attention the past week is Diginomica talking about a study where they looked at CIOs and their ability to understand value. and finding, frankly, that they don't seem to be that great at it. Honestly, that's how our careers have been. We've looked at, uh, seen everything from Cisco certifications to Amazon, et cetera. And certs have often been the definition of value rather than aligning our work specifically to business outcomes and goals. And it seems like we are starting to see a shift in how that value should be defined and what CIOs are being asked to do.
Well, I hope so. I feel like this is the battle of my life, that my entire career has been rooted in this sort of thing. In my first book, I talked about when I did all this research, and that was the crux of it, that
Mhm.
IT, unique to almost every other part of the enterprise, didn't really get created with intent. It just sort of evolved because people started buying this equipment. They needed someone to maintain it, and it just sort of happened. And it was
Mhm.
always rooted in this idea of automating to drive efficiency. That's always been the core of it. And so I think there's so much ingrained sort of cultural anchoring to that it's really, really hard. We joke, I don't know if it's a joke. We've talked for decades now about the need for IT and business alignment, right? And everyone always says, well,
Yes.
why is IT the only one that has to do business alignment? Well, it's mostly because the mentality that IT organizations have had in their relationship with the rest of the organization. And so it's a significant, significant challenge. And so this article basically talks about how CIOs need to switch their focus to productivity and away from efficiency. And what I love about it is that it's a subtle but all important distinction, right? That efficiency is just making things work smoother and faster, and that's great. And it is the foundation of productivity. It's very difficult to drive productivity gains without efficiency gains. But productivity is now adding that next layer of
Mhm.
business value. What are the outcomes you're trying to achieve? I'll add one more word to this, and that is effectiveness, right? Because the definition to me of productivity is efficiency plus effectiveness, right? When you put them together, when we're able to look at what are we trying to achieve, and does our technology enable that and not get in the way of it, then suddenly we can start measuring that and start looking at it. And I think it's brilliant. And I'm also not sure I have that much faith that this is going to be the time that it finally changes.
Yes, but I know I've run into this problem a lot when I talk to some of my peers in the telecom expense or cloud FinOps world. People who theoretically have a lot of alignment with the business because they deal with the financial aspects of IT. And I will ask them, how does your job directly relate to the strategic objectives of your company? And this should be a layup question, frankly, because you're already dealing with the money and they struggle to both answer what the company's strategic objectives are and what their actual role is in it. So the problem isn't necessarily that IT doesn't affect the business, but the people in IT don't know how to articulate how they are part of the business, and they are far enough removed from the strategy or choose to be far enough removed from the strategy that they don't know how these things come together. And it's not that that alignment doesn't exist, but I do think that IT, especially if you're at a managerial level or above, you need to be able to articulate very well what you do that strategically aligns to the business and is actually aligned to the goods and services of your company. That should be an easy thing to articulate.
The challenge is that it does. So one of the things I think with IT in particular is that it has historically been viewed as a horizontal career, right? You can go take your IT skills and work in any industry, but that completely disconnects with what you're talking about, right? If I'm trying to understand how we create value for the organization through the technology stack or through the technology architecture, well, then you have to have some domain expertise in that specific industry.
Yes.
And so that's where that disconnect. The best CIO I ever worked under was a non-technical CIO. He came from in healthcare, right? Healthcare operations. He was an operations guy. He knew healthcare inside and out. Didn't know squat about technology, and he was brilliant because he was not hampered by all of the underpinnings. He didn't care. He just said, "This is what we need to deliver to create value." Now, how are you going to go figure it out? I think the hard part is today, that was 25 years ago. Today, it's harder to be in that position because you have to understand the technology now. And so I think, the good news is I think we're seeing CIO salaries rise because a truly transformative CIO is someone that can sit in that space between those two, understand how the organization creates value, and then can wield the technology stack and the architecture to deliver it. But that is one heck of a skill set today. It is incredibly difficult to do. And so I think that it's the right message. And I think as a starting point, focusing on productivity, focusing on employee effectiveness rather
Mhm.
than just the efficiency of process, um, I think is a heck of a first step to really be moving down that road.
So for our last story, we are looking at the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, actually getting bamboozled when it comes to their data center use. They had apparently rented out a data center from a company called iNet, AINet, run by Deepak Jain, who apparently created a fake tier 4 data center certification based on a made up certifier called Uptime. Let's see, what is it? Uptime
Council,
Institute is
Uptime
the actual
Council.
one. Yes, but yes, he made a Uptime Council and got away with it for a few years before facts finally caught up to him.
14 years. It just it is shocking on so many levels that they created this and did it. But what I found, you and I talked before we started the recording about, oh, the CIO must be in a lot of trouble. How do they not check this? Well, the first big check mark is if you are a CIO or if you are part of the procurement team and you are putting in a requirement that someone has a certification, you might want to check it, right? And not just
Right.
because obviously someone glanced at this and said that looks official, good to go. But part of the reason that they got away with it for this whole time is that a tier 4 certification is supposed to deliver 99.995% uptime. And according to the report, they never failed on it. So they
Mhm.
actually did their job. They delivered, which makes this even more mind-boggling. It's like, I just don't understand. It's like, so you had the ability to meet the requirement, you just didn't go get the piece of paper, and
Mhm.
it just, yeah, I mean, it is absolutely mind-boggling to me that someone and this isn't just like a lost contract. He's going to jail, or at least that's what,
At least going to
he's
court.
been
Yeah. Hmm.
at least going to court, I mean, but they're going after him for a felony. I mean, this is serious, serious stuff. I'm
Right.
just like bewildering.
Yeah, I never want to go to court having charges of defrauding the United States. That usually does not end up well for anybody involved. And just looking at the Justice press release, Department of Justice press release, Jane orchestrated a years-long scheme to defraud the SEC by falsely certifying that his company's data center met the highest rating level when the actual rating did not satisfy the SEC contract. That is not what I want the US government claiming that I did. But I think, like you said, this is an important note that although we like making sure those check boxes exist, we still have to make sure that our lawyers and our security people are doing the dirty work of actually making sure that this stuff works correctly. And I think this is going to be even harder in a Gen AI world where it will be trivial to create the right language associated with certifications and to be able to say that our new fake organizations or pop-ups might uh, match very similar sounding actual organizations that provide these certifications. So either that's a problem or that's a business opportunity, depending, I guess, on which side of the coin you look at.
It is scary easy. My brother and sister-in-law, my wife's brother and wife, have a property where they now have some grapes, and they're not great grapes, but they decided to make wine out of it. And so, on a joke, I went into OpenAI and ChatGPT and told it to create a wine label. And let me tell you, in the fake of like a fake Bordeaux thing, it did a pretty convincing job. It wasn't perfect, but I mean, it is not a stretch to think that you can very quickly start creating these fakes of whatever you want. And so, I have two big takeaways. One is if you're going to ask for the cert, check for it. Check it. Make sure it's legit. Otherwise, you're just setting yourself up because
Mhm.
it's not in here. But I'm quite sure the procurement team is in all kinds of hot water over this. It's a
Mhm.
huge black eye. But secondly, I think that I've always had sort of a frustration with this in that don't ask for something if you don't actually need it, right? Don't limit yourself from a requirement standpoint. Understand what your actual requirements are. And this speaks to the fact that, particularly in government, but frankly, in most large enterprises, we end up with creating this way of just try to weeding people out, even though it doesn't actually help us get to who's going to provide the most value. I have no idea. I mean, the fact that he's willing to fake it probably means he wasn't a good person to be doing business with to begin with. But the point of it is that they went 14 years getting what was otherwise perfectly good service for them
Mhm.
without the certification that they claimed they absolutely needed to get quality service. So I think every CIO needs to always be asking themselves, going all the way back to the value question, right? How do I generate value for the organization? And what is the minimum viable path to get there, right? Because that's how
Mhm.
I'm going to create the most efficient way of doing that. And anchoring around those principles. Otherwise you end up with this. You end up with some guys faking a cert.
Yes, and I've definitely noticed that in IT contracts all the time, terms that are not contractually enforceable or would actually not be cost effective to enforce at all. And yet enterprises put these in because they think they are covering their butt by putting these phrases in place. And actually, if they wanted to make sure that these things would be enforced, sometimes it would cost more to enforce them than the entire contract is worth in the first place. It, that makes no sense. There's no reason to put that level of contractual obligation into any sort of contract. And vice versa. If you're on the vendor side, you're putting in terms that are impossible to either meet or manage or support. Maybe that's a problem for you as well.
But if you are a vendor, we would like to officially announce here that H&C certification company will officially be launching next week. Any certification you need, we charge half of anybody else, and we won't even come and pretend to check anything. So we'll give you your cert, and off you go. We'll be in the Bahamas by next week.
Right. Just put it into our unmarked bills or directly to our offshore bank account, and it's all good.
All good. All right.
And on that note, thanks for joining us this week for This Week in Enterprise Tech. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. Please leave your comments, and we look forward to talking to you next week.